Over here, the situation was a little different. Why? Well, actually, the issue was twofold. For one thing, because we're a much larger country, our rail lines were longer, our trains got longer and heavier, and we simply needed more reliable power to manage all of that. In the UK, that wasn't quite as big an issue, but they had their own problem: the loading gauge. Despite being the pioneers of railways and inventing the steam engine, the UK actually has one of the world's smallest standard gauge loading gauges, at just 12 feet 10 inches high and 9 feet wide. Most other places have way more room to work with. Our loading gauge here, by comparison, is enormous. As a result, not only do we have much more space to build rolling stock, but our lines also tend to be very heavily engineered to handle the weight of such large trains. The UK has always been restricted in this category, but in a way it almost influenced an elegance to British locomotive design. Mechanical engineers over there, whenever they produced a new type of steam engine, always had to keep those tight restrictions in mind while at the same time making each new engine much more powerful, as natural progression usually dictated. This meant they had to get very creative, resulting in engines that, while technically compact and small, actually produced a lot of power for their size. Over here, well, our engines were more powerful too, but partly that was because we just made them huge. This is certainly not a dig at my own country's locomotive design. We made some great things here too. But the point is that the UK's restrictions caused their technology to go in a slightly different direction. That's why our steam locomotives tend to be, well, still both steam engines, but obviously quite a bit different. That said, in terms of size and power, one particular engine in the UK historically stands out, as she was way, way bigger than basically anything else on the rails. In fact, quite literally, when it came to the UK, she was the longest and most powerful steam locomotive to ever run on British lines. She was the London and North Eastern Railway Class U1, a single example of a Garrett steam locomotive, a 2-8-0 plus 0-8-2. She was designed by the legendary Sir Nigel Gresley, and with a tractive effort of 72,940 pounds of force, she actually would have been pretty decent even on American rail lines, let alone Britain's. But what could this possibly be for? Why would they need such power on their own lines? Were trains really that heavy? Well, they were getting heavier, and a big issue the UK had to work out as trains also started getting longer was banking. Most locomotives, especially ones pulling really heavy trains, don't like hills. I don't like them. Some are better at it than others, like Shays, but a lot of regular conventional steam locomotives are like, oh my god, is that grade above 2%? No. Scary. Thus, the practice of incorporating banking locomotives, specialized banking locomotives, was started. These engines would often just hang out near notable grades on the line, and when a heavy train came by, they would couple to the back and push the train up the hill, assisting the regular locomotive until they got over it, and then they would uncouple. Sometimes they wouldn't even be coupled at all. They'd simply push and then go back down the hill and wait for the next one. Over time, this practice started becoming a bit more obsolete as engines got way more powerful, but especially in the early days, engines were only so strong. In fact, even over here we had areas where they still used banking engines for a long time because they were just necessary. The U1 was meant to be a banking engine, originally intended for the Worsborough Bank, sometimes called the Worsborough Incline, a particularly steep section on the Great Central Railway. And it wasn't just a steep bank, it was long. It climbed for 7 miles, with one particular stretch hitting 2.5%, which is really high for conventional locomotives. The area was notorious for the difficulty of getting a train up it, and for the immense struggle of getting a stalled locomotive started again while still on the grade. It didn't help that the main traffic on the line happened to be coal trains, which are heavy. So yeah, that was a problem. In the days of the GCR before the grouping, they had looked into several different solutions because they knew that area was difficult, and even examined a design based off a Kitson and Company locomotive that had been working in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. Interestingly enough, they couldn't use that design because of loading gauge restrictions. So instead, they started looking into a Garrett. Garretts tend to spread out the weight and are articulated, one of several designs that can kind of get around loading gauges to a degree, while still resulting in pretty big engines. This particular Garrett was actually based on 2 GCR 8K locomotives, later called the 04S 280 engines. Basically, it was 2 of their components effectively stuck together with the cab in the middle like a typical Garrett. It would also incorporate a larger boiler for more power, but it never left the drawing board prior to the grouping. And so, The issue of that bank became the London and North Easterns problem in 1923. Nigel Gressley was their chief mechanical engineer, and that original design proposal fell onto his desk. He looked at it and didn't make all that many changes, all things considered. The only major change Gressley really made was that instead of basing the engine off the 8 Burmese chots, he decided to use GNR02s. Other than that, it was pretty much the same idea. Bayer, Peacock and Company of Manchester tendered this design for £21,000, meant for the creation of 2 engines, though that order was later dropped to only 1. She was delivered to the railway in the summer of 1925 for a cost of £14,895, and was actually shipped in a hurry because they wanted this engine for the centenary celebration of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, where she would be on exhibit as number 42. She was still in her workshop grey livery at the time, and was later repainted to LNER black, officially accepted in August of 1925. Now, the engine, as I mentioned, was very powerful, and as a banker that was good, she needed to be. But she actually came with some minor problems that were not really ever addressed. For one thing, she was so big that there actually weren't very many places they could even put her. She was initially sent to the Barnsley sheds, but there wasn't any room. She was too big. Okay, so they transferred her to Mexborough on October 17, 1925. She did start work on the Worsborough Bank, and would go up and down the grade sometimes as much as 18 times a day. The trains were long and heavy, so they really needed the help. A typical train would consist of a Class 04 with over 60 loaded coal wagons behind it. So yeah, they needed help. That was a heavy train, especially by British standards. She often wouldn't even be the only one helping. Another 04 would be with her, or a tank engine of some kind. She would only be helping for part of the journey, though. She was often attached at the Wentworth Junction at the bottom of the bank, then pushed for 3.5 miles up to the West Silkstone Junction at the top. Other smaller assisting engines would normally keep going on as far as Dunford Bridge, while the U1 would go back down. Tactically speaking, she was very powerful, but the crews actually hated her guts. Mostly because not only was she unpleasant, but she was also hard to work with. She was a big, stinking baby. In fact, for the rest of this video, and only because I'm setting up a joke later, I'm going to be referring to her only as Baby. That's her name now. I have spoken. Her name is Baby, both because I think it's cute and endearing, and also because she was a big freaking baby. Prior to her introduction, her job would usually be handled by 204s. She could do the work of 2, but it was more effort to operate her. The crews did not appreciate this, summing it up by saying it was twice the work for the same miserable pay. That said, on paper, she was actually pretty pleasant to be on physically, technically, because she rode really well. She was smooth on the rails and had a pretty spacious cab. But the route involved 2 different tunnels just before the top of the bank. Given that she was often in the rear, behind at least 2 other steam engines, well, that resulted in just so much smoke. So much smoke. And it was hot and just awful for the crew. Gas masks had to be provided for them, but even that wasn't really well liked because the crews had to share them, and they didn't want to share them. That was gross. Often they simply covered their mouths with a wet handkerchief. Her boiler had to be retubed as early as 1926 due to some soft water, and her firebox was found to be damaged in 1927. She was out of service for 9 months during 1930, where she was given a new firebox and some other modifications. But she was often a pain in the backside, a big baby like I mentioned. Baby really needed the best quality coal, and only the best quality coal. If you did not give her the best quality coal, she'd throw a freaking fit. She didn't steam very well at all on low-quality coal. She was basically like Henry was. You could only give her the fanciest coal possible, and then she'd work. But unless you did that, she'd, I don't know, go hide in a tunnel so the rain didn't spoil her paint. Something like that. She continued working the Worsborough Bank for a number of years despite these issues because, at the end of the day, Baby was still very powerful and helpful. But her design was not repeated. It wasn't such a massive failure as to be retired early, but she wasn't good enough to ever try this again. There were also only so many places where such a large, powerful engine was even useful in the UK. By the late 1940s, her future was somewhat in doubt, mostly because both the Woodhead route and the Worsborough Bank had been electrified. The electric engines didn't necessarily need bankers, They had a lot more power available to them because they technically weren't producing any. It was all coming off the lines. Electric engines tend to be a lot more powerful because of this, and as a result, they didn't need baby anymore, at least not there. But in 1949, it was ultimately decided that she could go somewhere else on the network and maybe be somewhat helpful and even make a friend. A BFF, a bestie if you will. A big bestie. Big Bertha. Big Bertha is actually a pretty famous locomotive that a lot of people have asked me to talk about over the years. I don't have too much to say about her, but we'll talk about her now. She was another banking engine built to bank, very specialized for that role. She was a 0-10-0, a tender engine, but not one that would ever really pull a train because that's not what she was for. She didn't have any leading or trailing wheels. Bertha's only job was to push stuff up hills. And Baby was sent to the Licky Incline, where Bertha lived, to help her out. Together, the pair would assist very heavy trains up the hills. While this certainly didn't fix any of Baby's problems, they certainly made quite a pair for a few years. Their Baby and Bertha, their Baby and Bertha. One is a big chonk. The other loves drama. Their Baby and Bertha, their Baby and Bertha. Their Baby and BR. Yes, that was the joke I was setting up, and I'm not apologizing for it, dang it. One of the solutions they came up with to deal with the smoke problem was to start running Baby cab first, not chimney first. And that was fine, but the crews had trouble with visibility in this setup, especially when it was dark. After working with her bestie for a while, she was sent back to Mexborough in November of 1950 and then placed into storage. But by February of 1951, it was decided she was actually needed again back at the Worsborough Bank where she used to be. She did that until 1952, before a brief refurbishment at Gorton Locomotive Works and then sent back to the Licky Incline again to be with Bertha. During the time she was at the works for a period of about 3 years, they actually tried to correct the coal problem she had. Okay, so you need high-quality coal, you need the specialized coal, joke's on you, now you burn oil. Except, no matter how hard they tried, they could not get any kind of conversion to oil to be successful with her. She said, "No, you give me the nice coal and nothing else. I don't want oil. I want fancy coal." You see why I call her Baby now? In June of 1955, she did wind up back at the Licky Incline for at least a little bit longer, but would eventually return to Gorton and then be officially withdrawn just before Christmas, on December 23, 1955. Sadly, she was taken to Doncaster and cut up for scrap. For reference, her best friend, Big Bertha, would also suffer the same fate, being scrapped at Derby Works just the following year. It's a sad end for both because, okay, look, Bertha probably deserved to be preserved because she was really cool, but I'd actually make a case for Baby. Because, well, she was big. I know that sounds stupid, but in the context of the UK, we are talking about the largest steam engine you guys ever ran. The most powerful one too. That, on its own, is probably worthy of some level of preservation in my opinion. She would have been a really cool sight to see. Something to have. True. She was a spoiled, rotten little brat and a pain in the backside for the entirety of her existence. She was not a big success, but she was big, and I would have loved to see her. You know, I think a lot of us would. But sadly, it was not to be. Oh my gosh. Can you believe they gave me the bad coal again? I can't even believe these people. Anyway, what are we going to do tonight, Bertha? The same thing we do every night, Baby, try and take over the railways. They're Baby and Bertha.